Anyone who tried to outsmart the system and stash leftovers for the next day woke up to a nightmare. Their tents were crawling with maggots, reeking of unbearable rot. 3.5 millennia ago, an unexplained food falling straight from the sky saved over 2 million people from starvation in the barren desert. But this biological miracle hit a terrifying rule. It ruthlessly punished anyone who tried to hoard it for more than 24 hours. Why would a gift from God morph into a biological nightmare overnight? And how did the very physics of this substance completely change from one day to the next, defying the basic laws of decomposition? Buckle up. Today, we're dissecting the mystery of manna through a critical documentary lens you've never seen before. But before we take our first steps into the unforgiving sands of the Sinai, show your support. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. And drop a comment below. What's your name and what city are you watching from? It's a blessing to see how far this history is reaching. Euphoria is a dangerous emotion, my friends, mainly because its shelf life is incredibly short. Just weeks prior, this sea of people was singing. The echoes of the Red Sea crushing Pharaoh's military elite were still ringing in the ears of every man and woman. Freedom, after centuries of feeling the crack of the whip on their backs and trudging through mud, tasted incredibly sweet. But let's lay our cards on the table. Freedom doesn't fill an empty stomach. When the adrenaline of that great escape finally crashed, the harsh, bone-dry reality of the Sinai Desert came knocking. And believe me, the desert doesn't knock politely. Look coldly at the near-impossible logistics of this march, documented in the ancient records of Exodus chapter 16. This wasn't a weekend camping trip. History points to a staggering mass of humanity, estimated at around 2 million people. These were former slaves trapped in a relentless wasteland of rock and sand. There weren't enough oases. There were no nearby trade routes to buy supplies, not a single inch of fertile soil. They were literally cut off from the rest of the world. That little bit of unleavened bread and the meager rations they hurriedly packed during the escape barely lasted. The bill came due fast, and they were scraping the bottom of the barrel. The climate doesn't forgive the unprepared. Soon enough, the stomachs of millions began to growl in a terrifying chorus. The panic of mass extinction wasn't the whining of an ungrateful crowd. It was cold, hard math. Without food, they were all going to die. Put yourself in their shoes. Feel the visceral terror of a father watching his family's energy drain away, their lips cracked and eyes sunken. It's the kind of desperation that strips away a man's sanity. At this breaking point, faith takes a backseat to pure survival instinct. This crowd, scarred by generational trauma from slavery, began to shatter from the inside out. The murmuring swelled into a roar of rebellion. The pressure cooker blew its lid, and they backed Moses into a corner. The phrase recorded in those ancient texts hits like a punch to the gut. If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death. Moses' leadership was hanging by a thread, about to be swallowed whole by a violent mutiny. The leader who had defied the most powerful empire on earth was now entirely helpless against the understandable fury of his own people. The situation demanded a monumental intervention. Otherwise, the story of Israel would end as nothing more than a giant forgotten graveyard of bones in the Sinai. But Providence works on a time zone our impatience simply can't grasp. Just as the rope was about to snap, the heavens answered, except it didn't come with crashing thunder to silence the rebels. The answer slipped in quietly in the dead of the cold night. Opening their tents the next morning, expecting nothing but another day of slow death, the eyes of the crowd locked onto a scene that brought the camp to a standstill. The arid ground, where nothing ever grew, was blanketed by a bizarre substance, a thin, unexplainable carpet that was about to change the rules of survival and human biology forever. As the first rays of sunlight swept across the cold dunes of the Sinai that morning, the landscape that emerged made zero geographical or botanical sense. The masses, who had gone to sleep with growling stomachs and minds consumed by despair, started stepping out of their tents, squinting against the glare. The ground was no longer just the usual brown dust and jagged rocks. A fine layer covered absolutely everything. At first glance, many probably thought the brutal nighttime freeze had left a late frost. But when they touched it, the texture gave away a much deeper mystery. It was crumbly, flaky, almost like scales. Picking it up in the palm of their hands, they saw it was the size and shape of a coriander seed, but with a pearlescent hue, an almost translucent white. And the most intriguing part, in the middle of this dry, salty wasteland, the substance tasted sweet, remarkably like thin wafers baked with honey. Confusion took over the camp in a matter of minutes. Whispers of shock passed from mouth to mouth, tent to tent. Can you picture the scene? 2 million people crouching on the dirt, smelling and tasting something that had literally materialized out of thin air. The elders, the tribal leaders, the youth. No one had any record of this biology in human memory. Ancient Hebrew captured this exact moment of sheer shock. They looked at each other, holding those white seeds, and asked, "Man who?" Translated into plain English, they were saying, "What is it?" And from that genuine, bewildered question came the name that would echo through the millennia. What is it became manna. The very name of the miracle is, at its core, a confession of total ignorance in the face of the unexplainable. Now, let's bring this scenario to the table of modern science, because this is where our story gets heavy. Human nature hates the unexplainable. We have this nearly compulsive need to shove everything into a neat scientific box and lock the lid. Manna was no exception. For centuries, botanists, biologists, and researchers have racked their brains trying to find a natural justification for this narrative. The strongest and most famous theory among skeptics points to the tamarisk, a common tree in the Sinai region. According to this scientific angle, insects suck the sap from this tree and excrete a carbohydrate-rich substance. It's a sweet resin that crystallizes in the cold night air and drops to the ground. Local Bedouins even call it man. For skeptics, case closed. The Bible was just exaggerating a routine botanical phenomenon. Think again. This is where investigative logic separates urban myth from historical reality. Let's do the math. That insect resin only falls for a few weeks out of the year, at the peak of summer. The historical account is dead set. This food fell nonstop, rain or shine, through every season for a staggering 4 decades. On top of that, the yield from these trees is minuscule. A grown man would have to spend hours picking drops off the dirt just to gather a handful. The ancient text records that each person collected 1 omer a day, roughly 2 quarts of solid food. Multiply 2 quarts by 2 million people, every single day. We are talking about over 1 million gallons of food materializing on the desert floor at every sunrise. There is no tamarisk forest on the planet, let alone in a rocky wasteland, capable of sustaining an insect ecosystem that produces tons of this resin daily. Any attempt to chalk this event up to bug secretions hits a brick wall of large-scale math and biology. And there's an even darker detail in this natural equation. Tamarisk resin is basically sugar and carbs. It melts under the blazing sun, but it doesn't rot fast. The manna falling from the sky, however, had a completely unstable organic behavior. It was almost as if it had a genetic timer, hardwired to last only the exact span of one Earth rotation. And it was exactly this instability, this brutal, invisible rule of its expiration date, that caught thousands of Israelites off guard, turning their salvation into a straight-up biological horror movie inside their very own tents. The initial euphoria of finding the ground carpeted in this mysterious substance quickly gave way to a harsh reality check. As the chaos settled, Moses called the leaders together and passed down an order that changed the rules of the game. This wasn't an all-you-can-eat buffet. There was a golden rule, surgical and absolutely non-negotiable. Each person was to gather exactly 1 omer a day. To put that in perspective, an omer was just over 2 quarts. It was the exact quota, the precise measurement to keep an adult human nourished and on their feet for 24 hours. Nothing more, nothing less. And Moses' command came with a caveat that sounded almost sadistic to a desperate crowd. It was strictly forbidden to leave any leftovers for the next morning. Weigh the psychological impact of that order on the minds of these people. Manna didn't just drop onto the Sinai sands as a heavenly rescue to line empty stomachs. It came down like a scalpel to the soul of a deeply traumatized nation. To grasp the weight of what was happening, we have to get inside the fractured mind of a former slave. That entire generation had no clue what the word security meant. They were born feeling the whip crack on their backs, grew up watching their parents split crumbs, and spent the last few weeks marching with the grim reaper of starvation breathing down their necks. The most basic, primitive, visceral instinct of any human being who has stared starvation in the eyes is to hoard. Anyone who has scraped the bottom of the barrel wants to stockpile by any means necessary. It's the brain's natural defense mechanism against the dread of tomorrow. Man builds monumental barns, hoards reserves, locks food away, all to buy the false illusion that he holds the reins to the future. And suddenly, in the middle of a barren wasteland that didn't even offer a cactus, their only source of life came tethered to an absolute ban on saving. The demand was to gather today's sustenance and leave tomorrow hanging on the blind trust of a promise. In their eyes, it was psychological warfare. A people hardened by extreme scarcity was forced to go to sleep with full stomachs but completely empty pots, needing to believe the sky would tear open right on schedule the next dawn. It was a brutal test of dependency. This miracle was forcefully shattering the human security system built entirely on fear. They had to learn to look up instead of looking into their own pantries. The dynamics of this food didn't leave any room for laziness. The historical record points out a fascinating physical detail. The harvest had to happen in the early hours of the day. Once the sun rose and scorched the desert sand, the substance simply melted and evaporated. The miracle demanded action, discipline, and sweat. You had to get up early, cut through the freezing morning breeze with your bowl, and secure your family's meal. And the divine math operated in a way that defied the basic laws of logic. Whoever got greedy and tried to gather extra upon measuring their omer back inside the tent saw there was absolutely nothing left over. On the flip side, the one who, out of weakness or old age, gathered a little less, checked their measure, and found they lacked nothing. It was the perfect equalizer. Social inequality didn't exist in the camp of the Manna, but the rule clashed head-on with human greed. It's incredibly easy for us to sit back and judge the situation, sitting here with a full fridge and a supermarket right around the corner. But try putting yourself in the shoes of a father in those thin canvas tents, with little kids crying in a barren wasteland just outside the flap. You step out in the morning, the ground is covered, you fill your omer, and you see there's still plenty of room in the pot. The natural instinct of self-preservation screams in your ear, grab more. What if a sandstorm rolls in tomorrow and buries it all? What if Moses is losing his mind? What if the miracle fails? Fear is an incredibly persuasive counselor. Hoarding seemed like the most logical, sensible, and responsible move any head of a household could make. In this massive open-air laboratory, the Creator wasn't just pulling Israel out of Egypt. The hard work was pulling Egypt out of Israel. Egypt represented self-sufficiency built on the sweat of your brow, a culture of you are what you produce and what you keep. By instituting a daily survival quota, the system was kicking out those crutches, forcing them to live in the right. Now, think about the sheer tension of those first few nights. Laying your head on the dirt, knowing there wasn't a single grain secured for tomorrow. The human logic of hoarding had to be crushed to make way for a brand new mindset. The problem is, human nature is stubbornly resilient. Inevitably, in the dead of night, many decided to call the bluff. They figured they could game the system, find a loophole, and stash a little extra at the bottom of the bag, safely out of Moses' sight. And it was exactly that fear, dressed up as caution, that triggered a terrifying gear within the biological makeup of that mysterious bread. Fear, my friends, is a treacherous beast. It whispers in our ears in the dead of night when the lights go out and logic goes to sleep. When you have an entire family breathing under the thin roof of a tent in the middle of a deadly desert, caution feels like the most sensible thing in the world, and that's exactly what went down. Despite Moses' strict, categorical, no-nonsense warning, the old human nature spoke louder. Under the cover of darkness, hiding from their neighbors and leaders, many fathers bent the rules. They gathered a little extra, a handful here, an extra bowl there, and they shoved it deep into clay pots covered with rags, convinced they were being incredibly smart. After all, who in their right mind would blindly trust the sky to punctually rain bread the very next day? It was the ancient instinct of survival, crashing head-on into the new rule of absolute dependency. But what these would-be masterminds didn't know was that this biological miracle came with a built-in self-destruct sequence. Manna wasn't just food. It was a ruthless judge of greed. The sunrise the next day didn't just bring light. It brought absolute, unadulterated panic. Try to visualize the scene and the sheer despair. A guy wakes up, maybe with a smirk on his face, thinking he's secured his family's breakfast without having to freeze in the morning dawn. He walks over to his hidden stash, pulls back the cloth, and suddenly his stomach violently churns. The stench radiating from that pot is indescribable, a nauseating odor of organic matter in an advanced state of decay, a stench of pure rot that slices through the air and infests the entire tent in a matter of seconds. And the sight was even worse than the smell. That delicate, pearlescent substance, which just yesterday smelled of honey and looked like coriander seed, was now seething. The sacred text is brutally frank and doesn't spare the details. The manna simply bred worms. It was completely overrun by a mass of starving white maggots writhing in a puddle of putrid sludge. How does science explain this? How does a carbohydrate-rich food, lacking even enough moisture to rot quickly, undergo such a violent mutation, shattering the laws of cellular decomposition in under 24 hours? There is no climate or bacteria in the desert capable of accelerating putrefaction to that level overnight. This was the pinnacle of pedagogical terror. The divine message was delivered like a punch to the gut. Disobedience and selfishness didn't just earn you a boring lecture from the leadership. They brought maggots right into your home, right onto your dinner table. The man who tried to outsmart the rules and hoarded out of a lack of faith woke up literally embracing death. When Moses caught wind of what happened, he was furious. These people were playing with fire, grossly underestimating the gravity of the miracle. The rot of the hoarded manna physically and disgustingly mirrored the rotting hearts of those who refused to trust the provider. The divine expiration date was exact, down to the millimeter, and strictly non-negotiable. The message was loud and clear. Either you live one day at a time, or your false sense of security is going to rot right in your hands. That massive reality check silenced the camp and completely destroyed any further attempts to stockpile food. It took a long time for the stench of rot to clear out of those tents, and the lesson was permanently seared into the minds of that generation. Nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, would dare test the physics of the manna ever again. At least, not on normal days. Because, as with every great mystery, there was a single exception where the rot would be inexplicably canceled out. Disobedience brought rot, but obedience was about to unleash an even greater mystery upon the camp of Israel. The manna had already proven to be a brutal biological anomaly, defying normal decomposition and severely punishing anyone who tried to break the strict 24-hour rule. The message had been received loud and clear, and the daily math of survival had been learned through shock and awe. However, the Sinai Desert was about to set the stage for an event that would leave any modern physicist, chemist, or biologist completely floored. When Friday rolled around, the organic clock of this celestial substance simply shifted gears. Moses' instruction, which up until yesterday was a deadly warning against hoarding, took a sudden turn that felt like a massive strategic error. On that sixth day of the week, the order was unusual and blunt. Gather exactly double, 2 omers ahead. For a second, set the pieces on the board. This very same crowd had witnessed the nauseating nightmare of maggots infesting the tents of those who dared to stash leftovers. The smell of rotting organic matter was likely still haunting the olfactory memory of the entire camp. And now, the very leader who laid down the absolute ban was telling them to stockpile. The tension in the air must have been palpable. Would their pots wake up swarming with larvae and sludge all over again? The justification for this abrupt breach of protocol was something that completely transcended the laws of physics. The establishment of the Sabbath, the day of absolute rest. On the seventh day, the sky would remain locked shut like an iron wall, and dust would be the only thing lining the ground. This is exactly where the behavior of this matter becomes an unsustainable paradox for natural science. Follow this historical logic. For 5 straight days, the biology of the substance operated under a law of hyper-accelerated degradation. If exposed to the elements for more than one solar cycle, the molecular structure violently collapsed. But on Friday night, that exact same substance, gathered from the exact same barren dirt and under the exact same cruel climate conditions, entered an unexplainable state of preservation. The physics of the miracle instantly altered its own nature, solely to honor the theology of rest. Saturday morning dawned cold, and the terror so many fathers feared never materialized. The sealed clay pots were opened with extreme hesitation. People probably turned their faces away, bracing for the hit of that deadly odor and the repulsive sight of white maggots. But what they found was the food completely intact, fresh, and carrying the same sweet aroma as the day before. The exact same matter, subjected to totally opposite biological behaviors, depending entirely and exclusively on the day of the week it was being consumed. There is no ecosystem, desert climate, tamarisk, insect resin, or fungus on planet Earth that has a weekly calendar hardwired into its DNA. The phenomenon wasn't just the continuous supply of food sprouting from nothing. It was an overt, absolute control over the very law of entropy and decomposition. This organic shock completely recalibrated the mindset of an entire nation. They were forced to understand that they weren't dealing with some random natural fluke, but with a force that demanded and valued the pause. Halting the harvest on Saturday forced the nation to stop staring obsessively at the dry dirt for survival, and remember that they were no longer just production cogs in the Egyptian empire. They were free human beings entitled to dignified rest. The unreal preservation of the manna on Friday served as the ultimate seal of guarantee that providence would sustain them all while they rested. Even so, human stubbornness is a scar that's incredibly hard to fade. Ancient records document that, even with crystal clear instructions and a tent with a full pantry, a few individuals grabbed their bowls at the dawn of the seventh day and went wandering, scouring the sands for a little extra. The sky was locked and the ground was completely bare. Exactly as Moses had promised, this persistent, compulsive drive to hunt for resources lays bare humanity's chronic inability to accept that the work is done and to simply rest in what has already been provided. And this incredible preservation capacity of the manna, which operated on a provisional basis every Friday, Arbe was about to be perpetually tested inside the most inaccessible place on Earth. The biological anomaly of manna had already proven its firepower in brutal fashion. The entire math of decomposition seemed completely suspended on Fridays, yet terrifyingly accelerated on regular days for anyone who broke the rules. But let's be real. If the story died there, it would be way too easy for future generations to write it all off as just another folktale. A myth dreamed up by dehydrated Bedouins hallucinating from hunger under the blazing Sinai sun. The world needed physical proof, something tangible in the real world that would silence the skeptics once and for all. And with that historical documentary vision in mind, Moses made a call that pushed the mystery of this substance to an absolutely insane level. He ordered an exact sample, one single omer of the food, to be collected and permanently sealed inside a jar of pure gold. Think about the sheer scale of the paradox happening right there. The exact same organic material that crawled with maggots and made tents smell like a morgue in a mere 24 hours was now going to be locked up and sealed tight. And this jar wasn't destined for some king's fancy display shelf. It was sent straight into the most lethal, high-tension, and inaccessible square footage of the ancient world, the Holy of Holies. There, in pitch blackness, this biological relic was deposited directly inside the Ark of the Covenant. That's right, the sacred golden box holding the tablets of the law, radiating a presence so overwhelming it would strike down anyone who dared to touch it carelessly. How is it even possible that such an absurdly unstable substance completely bypassed the most basic laws of cellular degradation from that moment on? Put your rational mind to work and try to find a scientific loophole to justify this. We aren't talking about a handful of rock salt or a piece of granite. We are talking about a moist food source, trapped in a sealed container, trekking through a desert with hellish heat waves, and later facing the erratic climate of Canaan. The natural script dictated that in a matter of days, the pressure from putrefaction gases would blow that gold jar apart from the inside, turning the very heart of the ark into a festering swamp of maggots and sludge. But history took a different turn, completely breaking the spine of biology. Weeks turned into months, years bled into decades, and the decades stacked up into centuries. The canvas camp in the desert evolved into a monumental stone temple in the city of Jerusalem. And through all that time, whenever the high priest stepped into the Holy of Holies once a year, sweating cold, his heart pounding out of his chest from the sheer tension, the ark remained flawless. That single omer of manna, the exact same stuff that lined the stomachs of desperate former slaves way back when, was literally frozen in time. It didn't dry out. It didn't crumble. It wasn't attacked by fungus, and it certainly didn't become a breeding ground for bugs. The miracle simply deactivated its own self-destruct button permanently. That untouchable relic in the dark became the physical proof hammered into history. It silently screamed that the very hand that fed millions in the middle of nowhere is the exact same hand that has the authority to pause the clocks of the universe whenever it sees fit. It was a harsh warning, kept under lock and key. True survival has never relied solely on the logical gears of this world. When we look back at the Sinai Desert through the lens of history, it becomes crystal clear that the real miracle was never just about filling the stomachs of an exhausted crowd. That unexplainable food blanketing the barren dirt every single morning had a target much deeper than simple biology. Manna didn't just drop from the sky to cure their hunger. It was surgically designed to destroy the chronic fear of tomorrow. And let's be brutally honest, that is a battle our minds still fight every single day. 3.5 millennia ago, that generation of freed slaves was forced to swallow the most painful, countercultural lesson a human being can learn. The art of living strictly one day at a time, the uncompromising daily quota, the ruthless expiration date, and the nauseating stench of rot in the tents of the disobedient were brutal reminders. They proved that our obsession with trying to control the future is an incredibly fragile illusion. They had to trade the fake security of full pots for the absolute dependence that the sky would do its job again the next morning. Bringing this ancient reflection into our modern reality, I'll leave you with a question to chew on. If you were there, boots on that scorching sand, with your entire family relying on you to survive, could you hold back your own survival instinct? Would you have the guts to go to sleep with empty pots, trusting blindly that sustenance would come at dawn? Or would you have found a way to stash some leftovers in the back of your tent? It's real easy to judge history from a distance when we've got a full fridge and a supermarket right around the corner. If this deep dive into the past made you stop and see these ancient records through a more mature, profound lens, back our project. Hit that like button on this video. It's what keeps us producing these high-quality breakdowns. And while you're at it, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming documentaries. The history of our world still holds a ton of mysteries buried under the sand, just waiting to be uncovered. Stay curious, and we'll see you in the next deep dive.